This is a big story about a very unexpected hero. Hundreds of years ago, the forces that held reality together began to crack. And from this crack, there came the giants. Now, an order had to be established to combat these great beasts. And so was formed the Knights of the Giants. I could go on and on telling you stories about these heroes. For instance, Frederick the Great, who took down an entire army of giants with a single sword. Or Baldur the Friar, who was able to out-wrestle Gorm the Toothless, and, despite the name, this giant actually had a row of sharp teeth and was known to be quite a biter. Or Henrik the Bold, who was able to defeat the great Jotner, who was so tall that his head reached up into the clouds, and he could bring the mountains down with his feet. But let me talk instead, for a while, about the squire that served them, Jonah. Jonah was a very faithful and loyal squire, and he truly believed in the laws of chivalry. He would often do chores for the Knights of the Giants. He would trim their horses' tails or clean out the stables. Or he might go out into the forest and hunt for them, or get them herbs to heal their wounds. And when they were bored, he would sing them songs and tell them tales. And he was loved by all of the knights, but he had another side to him. For when he went home, he would often go to the pub and drink for hours and hours at a time. And when he arrived home to his son, who would be waiting there eagerly for him, he would sit down and tell him stories. And I'm afraid he was a little bit dishonest in his tales, for he would often claim that he was one of the Knights of the Giants, and that he was fighting these great wars. And his son would listen to him with wide eyes, and when he would go to sleep he would have dreams of his father in great battles. And this went on for many years, until Jonah died from old age. And Terrence decided that he needed to follow in his father's footsteps. And so he left the little town of Tartary, and went to the Abbey of Saint Michael's, where the Knights of the Giant presided. Well, this had been, after all, many years later, and many of the giants had been killed off, and as well, many of the knights had died, or had moved off into other countries. And in fact, only one was left, Father Methuselah. Now, Father Methuselah was a rather peaceful man in his old age, and preferred to sit around and farm, and just speak of the divine. And he had a little group that worked for him. There was quite a few of them. There was a Mother Margaret, a rather strict old lady who was seen as the second in command next to Father Methuselah. There was Sister Josephine, a sweet girl. Roland, a country boy, who was known to be just a little bit hard-headed, but very nice down deep. And then, of course, there was Cook Gilbert and Dr. Kinham. And they all lived rather peacefully there. And when Terrence arrived, he was very nervous. He was tripping over his own feet, and he stammered as he talked to Father Methuselah, but he managed to get out what he wanted to say. He asked him to allow him to be one of the Knights of the Giant, or to do a few chores for the place. I can prove how much of a hard worker I am. Well, Father Methuselah listened to him, and Terrence told him how his father, Jonah, had been one of the Knights of the Giants, one of the 25. And Father Methuselah listened, and he went to his little group, and he said, "The boy seems to believe that his father was one of the knights, even though this wasn't true, but he was one of our most loyal squires, and for him I would like to give this boy a job, something to do around the abbey." Well, Mother Margaret was against this idea. "That boy looks like he would be trouble. His fingernails are all dirty, and he was tripping over his feet and stammering his words. I think that the boy will bring bad things. I just have a bad feeling about that." Sister Josephine was much more sweeter and said she would love to have him do a little chores and that she had a few ideas, and Roland was actually completely for this idea. He thought that if the squire had been so good, then Terrence was going to be a great help around the abbey. So Father Methuselah said, Very well, we'll go ahead and let the boy and give him a try. And so it was that Terrence began working, and his first job was picking apples in the orchard. Now, Terrence himself did a pretty good job with this, until one day Mother Margaret was walking by the pond when she heard a loud noise, and she saw that Terrence had accidentally lost control of the wagon. It was falling down the hill, and she let out a scream, and she was afraid it was going to hit her, but instead it landed it hit a tree, and from the tree there dropped a giant's bee's nest, which fell down onto the ground, and a swarm of bees came at Mother Margaret. And soon enough she was going to Dr. Kinnan and had all these boils on her face and on her hands, and she told Father Methuselah, "You really must let the boy go. I told you he would be nothing but trouble." But Father Methuselah said that the boy just made a mistake, and he would give him some other job. So he did. He let him work with Sister Josephine in the garden. And Sister Josephine was more than happy to show the boy how to do everything, but he kept making mistakes and doing things that he wasn't supposed to do. He even broke one of the keys in the lock. And finally, she asked him to go ahead and just water the flowers, and that would be his main job. So he did this, and for a while it seemed to work. But then one day Sister Josephine noticed that all the flowers in the entire abbey had begun to wither away, and she couldn't understand why, and she went to Terrence, and she realized that what he thought had been water was actually the same ingredients used to make Greek fire. And she told him that this was very bad news, and she went to Father Methuselah, and he said that, well, this boy is really getting into my head a little bit, but I still would like to honor the memory of his father, so we'll go ahead and give him a few more chores around the abbey. And that's what they did, but with every chore Terrence was given, he would fail. He would trip over his own feet when he was asked to work for Cook Gilbert's. He poured salt into the pot without realizing it, and all of them were puking up a storm. And he would work for Dr. Kinnan, but all the people would get even more sick. So finally he worked with Roland, who was not too happy about having him under his wing, but it seemed to be okay for a while, until one day there was going to be a little party held for the whole abbey, and Terrence was tasked with just mopping the floor. Well, Terrence noticed that the ointment that Roland was telling him to mop the floor with, it seemed a little strange, and he wanted to tell him, but he was too afraid that he'd get in trouble. So he mopped up the floor, and when the party people arrived and they started walking on, they found that their feet stick to the floor, and it took a lot of work to push their feet off. And then a swarm of gnats came and began to bite at them, and it was just a huge pestilence, all of those little people at the Abbey of Saint Michael's. And it soon became clear what Terrence had done, although even Terrence didn't understand how he could make such a huge mistake. He had accidentally poured syrup all over the floor, and that had caused everyone to stick and all the gnats to arrive. So Father Methuselah held a little council, and all of them were in agreement, with the exception of Sister Josephine, that Terrence should leave the abbey. And Father Methuselah said, "Well, I hate to do it, but the boy he's caused poor Mother Margaret to get boils. He has caused the flowers to all die off. He has caused a pestilence on this abbey, so I feel I have no other choice." So he went and he found Terrence, and he was cutting up some wood, and he sat down, and the boy said how glad he was to be working there for the abbey, and how he hoped very soon to be a great knight. And Father Methuselah said, "My son, I am afraid that we are going to have to let you go. You see, you have caused far too much damage, and the cost of you is too much. We cannot afford it. I very much hate to do this to you, my son." And Terrence said, "Oh, but you can't. I was so hoping to become one of the Knights of the Giant like my father. Maybe there's something that I can do." And Father Methuselah lowered his head and said, "About that, my son, I'm afraid to tell you this, but your father was not a giant slayer." He hated saying this to the boy, and you could see the disappointment in his eyes, but Terrence said, "Oh, it's all right, Father. I'm glad that you told me, and that you were honest with me. I suppose the best thing for me to do is to just move on. I'm sorry that I've cost you all so much." and he could see that the boy was downtrodden, and offered him some money and some supplies for wherever he was going, but Terrence refused them and said that it was best if he just went off. And so Terrence left, and Father Methuselah was sad, but also he couldn't deny a bit relieved. And I hate to end the story off on such a sad note, but we are going to have to say to be continued for now. We'll hear more from this fairy tale later. But until then, sweet dreams and good night.